I know they say democracy is hard, but I was not expecting it to be because of YouTube. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me doing something. And today I'll do, well, democracy for my channel. Nothing beyond that. And I can promise that your votes will, in fact, count. This is the video I promised to make where I talk about books for what will be, well, something mass, I guess. I'll have to come up with a proper title whenever we, you know, have actually settled. By which I mean we'll talk about the 5 book series I have selected that you get to vote on from now on until the 19th of October. Before I announce the winner on the 20th in the weekly navel gazing. That's if I got the dates right. I'm not sure about that. If I look somewhat like I've been punched in the face, that is because I'm still recovering from that tooth surgery, and my face might still be somewhat swollen because of that. Anyway, why am I saying it's hard? Well, it is because I tried to actually do all of this. I recorded the entire video yesterday, and then I tried to set up the poll, and turns out YouTube only allows 4 options on its polls on its community tab, which is ridiculous, and I thought it was 5, but you know, here we are. So I then tried to figure out where else to do the actual voting, because reducing it to like 4 options felt kind of stupid. So I thought I'll use like a third-party tool, like say SurveyMonkey, and there the free options are only limited to 25 voters, or responses. So that is also not an option, because maybe it's more than 25 of you who want to vote. So we can't actually do that either. So yeah, I've been trying to figure out how to do an actual vote on books for a holiday reading season of 13 videos about 13 books. And the result is, there will be a poll on Patreon, on my Patreon page, but I can actually keep that post open to the entire world, so you don't have to actually join the Patreon. You can, or give me money for that. It will be open to anyone. Maybe you have to become a free subscriber. I'm not quite sure if that's the case or not, but you can figure that one out. It will not cost you any money. You can just vote there. I'll link it down below in the description. I don't think I can link it in the comment, because YouTube doesn't allow links that go outside of YouTube in its actual comments, but it will be in the description, and I will also make a community tab update with the details there as well. And you can vote for one of 5 book series on the Patreon, and you will, well, I guess, hopefully just tell me what to read at the end of the year. So that's the mechanics. Once again, I'm really sorry this is this convoluted. I was not expecting it to be this difficult, but, well, here we are. That is how it is. If you have opinions, views, further comments and so forth, please leave them under this video. I think that's the best way for me to actually reach all of them. I guess you can also comment under the Patreon post, Patreon poll. That is obviously also an option, but you know, do whatever you want is what I'm saying here. And now let's move on to the actual plan, which is me explaining once again what the whatever holiday mass kind of thing will be, and then explaining why I chose the 5 series that I picked from your suggestions and my thoughts and so forth, and give you a quick introduction what each of them is, so you are well-informed voters and can then do the thing, which is, well, democracy. Celebrate it as long as you can, is my point here. And yeah, let's do that. So, a quick history lesson for those of you who haven't been around for the first 2 times. In 2023, for reasons that I can't fully remember at this point, I decided to do a thing which I called Drismas, which is in those 13 nights, which in German we are calling Rauhnächte, which is the nights between Christmas and Epiphany. Epiphany being, you know, the 6th of January for those of you who don't know your Catholic holidays. Anyway, those have like all kinds of mystical and sort of like weird folkloric connections and I figured, why not do something in the holiday season, which is make a video about 1 book per day, so you can have something to talk about. And for the first year, as I said, I called it Drismas, and I read 13 Drizzt Do'Urden Dark Elf books by R.A. Salvatore in publication order, to just figure out how I feel about them now, because I read them as a kid, and yeah. that was an interesting experience, and it did lead to me very much losing my mind again and again and again, because those books, well, did not exactly hold up well. I was kind of expecting that, but it was far worse than I thought. But it was kind of fun as well, because, you know, they're really bad, and it's easy to make fun of them. And, you know, what with YouTube being a place where everyone is constantly mocking books that are targeted at young women, I felt it was more than fair to, you know, look at a series that is predominantly targeted at young men and is also really, really bad. So, you know, gender equality and all of that. Yeah, so that's why I did that, and I really enjoyed it. And then last summer, I asked you guys if you wanted me to do the same thing again, and well, you said yes, and I gave you a bunch of possible ideas, and you selected Redwall by Brian Jakes, which is, well, a series that is really, really cool. It's children's books I hadn't read as a child because they weren't really popular in German. I don't even know if they were actually already translated into German when I was in the age that you usually read Redwall, so I did not read them as a kid. I had heard of them, of course, in the past, and so I was excited to read them, and turns out they were really fun. Yes, not everything was perfect, because, you know, 13 books, there's going to be some problems in there. That's just like how these things work, because there's, you know, just a lot of books that have been, you know, published over like the span of like 20 years or so, and yeah. But I had fun with that, and that was Mouse Mess, because, you know, there's a lot of mice in Redwall. And once again, I did like 13 videos, technically in 13 days for both times. There were like 1 or 2 days where I didn't manage to keep up the schedule because I'm really bad at planning, but that's roughly the idea. So that's the thing. And then last week, 2 weeks ago, I asked you guys if you want me to do the same thing again. And you said yes, predominantly. And you made some suggestions for book series, and I have some ideas about book series that I could think of, and that is where we are now. I'll present 5 of those. I'll explain why I picked those 5, and you get to choose. And yeah, as I said, I'll announce the results on the 20th of October. That should give all of us, or those of you who are interested in reading along, if you feel like it, enough time to get your hands on some of those books in one way or another, and possibly even start reading in advance. I'll certainly try to read a couple in advance so I can, you know, maybe stick to the actual schedule this time around. We'll find out about that. But I also can't just like buy 13 books in case that's something gets picked where I don't already own some of the books. So that's partly the thing. So some of the general thoughts here, right? For me, this is a bit of like an end of year sort of celebration, a bit of a thank you to you guys for watching me, and I usually try to, you know, as I said, I start with like around Christmas and go into like January, because there's a lot of book people, or not just booktubers, like a lot of YouTubers do specific things for December. Like one of the reasons, of course, that in December there's normally or usually a lot more ad money to be had, because, you know, everyone is trying to get their last advertisements in before the massive like holiday shopping madness in a lot of ways. So there's that, and, you know, a lot of people have like a Christian background, at least culturally, so having, you know, your Christmas calendar with like 24 days to Christmas or whatever, like having those kind of things is popular. So like the first part, like the first 3 weeks of December are often really packed with way too many videos, but then like people usually, you know, fall into the whole like holiday coma, eating too much and so forth, no matter like their actual, you know, religious convictions or whatever. So I figured like doing something that spans that weird time between Christmas and New Year's, and possibly like the first week of January where a lot of people still are, you know, off work or whatever, and would be nice. And picking one series, I think, is also one of the, you know, is just a nice way of doing that. Ideally, it builds sort of like a tension, because we go through those books like one book at a time in publication order, so we can see how something develops over time, how a writer changes over time, and you know, I like going through authors' works generally in publication order and doing that. I've done something like that with, say, the Dan Simmons books, the science fiction books. I am still doing this for, I have done it, of course, for Discworld. I'm still doing it for both the Culture series by Ian M. Banks, and I'm doing it for the general like science fiction works of Ian MacDonald. I'll hopefully get back to those relatively soon. But like, it's just like generally a way I like to read books, because I think we can learn a lot about that. Some of these are, I guess, more, you know, specific. With like the Dan Simmons stuff, it was like looking at a specific question, which of course was like, was he always a Nazi or just something that happened over time? I think I've answered that question, but and with Ian MacDonald, it's just like no one talks about Ian MacDonald, and I love Ian MacDonald, and I think it's worth talking about what an amazing author he is. Same goes with Discord, of course. My point is that with these holiday reads, I try to pick something that is slightly different from that in some way or another. They are obviously shorter because I have to read them relatively quickly, and something, I can't do that with, say, The Wheel of Time. Like 14 Wheel of Time books in 14 days is too much. Just not possible, right? Same goes for, say, Ted Williams's Austen Art books, which, yes, I will still get to, like, The Last King of Austen Art. I own the books, I just have to read them and make the final videos, because I did, of course, start with the first 3 books, which are basically, 3 books that are sometimes 4, because, the man writes trilogies in 4 volumes, usually, and so forth, but I will get back to that as well. Anyway, so I usually try to get something that is relatively short, which is, for example, why I did not allow something like Sword of Truth as well, which, I haven't read beyond Wizard's First Rule. I don't plan to, but it would be too much for, this specific type of project. The same goes for Shannara, which is certainly something that might also otherwise be right up in that sort of like field of interest in a lot of ways. So yeah. So size does in fact matter in this regard, and sometimes bigger is not better, at least not in this specific use case, right? So that's one thing. And the other, as I said, is a bit like about nostalgia. Midwinter, no matter your holidays, right, is often sort of like a time of like reflection, looking back, and also something that is often like laden with nostalgia in a lot of ways. So both with Drizzt, where I, confronted and exercised some of my own childhood demons in a lot of ways, and with Redwall, which has probably been a childhood memory for a lot of readers, right? I felt those fit somewhat thematically to that, like, reflection, stepping back, looking in the past, and so forth, in a lot of ways. That's something that I find helpful for this specific sort of type of book in a lot of ways. I try not to get too dark and too angry in those videos. Yes, I got pretty mad at Drizzt and Salvatore in those videos, but there was still enough just ridiculously stupid shit going on that just needs to be mocked and made fun of, and not just pointed out as like being dangerous, evil, or whatever, right? So they often are somewhat more lighthearted in that regard as well. So that is sort of like ideas that guide my thoughts on like what kind of books might work really well for this specific sort of like midwinter reading thing, right? And those, were sort of the criteria that I applied to your suggestions and to the ones that I'm interested in, because at the end of the day, yes, I take in your suggestions. There are 2 that you made that I have not picked this time around, simply because I didn't feel like it, for just like personal reasons, but they might be there next year should I actually do the same thing next year again. Should the world still exist? Should I still exist? Should this channel still exist? Should you still want me to do the thing? But others, I picked, and those are sort of like the criteria that I'm willing to either read something that I have read as a kid or in the past and sort of like go back and see if it's holding up well, or picking something that I should have read as a younger person and for one reason or another did not, because something just didn't happen, right? So those are often like ideas that I also sort of figure here. So it's possible to pick something for me new, but something that has some value, sort of like nostalgic value, or at least impact for some of you guys. So that's a long way of getting to the actual books. As I said, I have picked 5 series. I'm going to go through these in alphabetic order. By alphabetic, I mean first letter of the true, like, last name of one of the authors, right? That's how we're doing this, simply to avoid any further sort of like me ranking them in preference or whatever. And I'm really bad at making those kind of rankings to begin with, but that's how I decided to go through this. That's the choice here. So no priorities implied by the way we're going through this. All of this being said, let's start with the first one, which is the Vlad Taltos series by Stephen Brust. I have no idea how to pronounce that. But that's something I guess I'll find out until then. The Vlad Taltos series. Now, these are interesting. They've been, going on. There's 17 out so far. There's like 2 more to come. And we'll go through the first 13. I might still read the last ones if I really enjoy them, because, Vlad Tolstoy is definitely a bit of an underground sort of like tip when it comes to fantasy. The first one was published in 1983, and they're still still getting published. So they span a lot of time and development by both like the author and the world around it and so forth. They have had impact on other authors in a lot of ways. A lot of other fantasy, I would argue, but it's not something that gets a lot of attention on YouTube or other social media these days. They have some really weird cover artworks from time to time, and Stephen Brust is also generally a fascinating kind of character himself. He plays, does like folk music and folk rock music beyond just doing this, and he has like Hungarian roots, which is where the name Vlad Tolstoy comes from. Tolstoy obviously being a supernatural being in Hungarian folklore, a bit of a demon devil kind of creature as far as I'm aware of, right? So what is this Vlad Tolstoy? So it's a science fiction, well, it's a fantasy world that has some science fantasy elements. This is the time when we still thought of like the whole thing as like one world where like, the borders between fantasy and science fiction weren't really rigid. They became fairly rigid during, like, say, the later 80s and definitely the 90s and early 2000s. Luckily, this sort of like harsh genre division is once again breaking down, which I think is a good thing. Anyway, so they are basically fantasy, and you can probably ignore the science fiction elements in there. They are about a planet, or like an empire, the Dragaean Empire, which is the Dragaeans being somewhat elf-like creatures, long-lived, and they have noble houses. They live in a place that is constantly dark because it's always overcast and clouded and so forth. Vlad Tolstoy himself is a human, an Easterling, and he is, part of one of these high houses, even though he's not officially a Dragaean and doesn't have like all their powers or anything of the sorts. But that specific house does in fact allow other people to enter or at least buy into the house and buy titles within that specific noble house. And, wouldn't you believe it? They're the organized crime syndicate, basically. So these are stories about someone who does, I guess, crimey things like assassinations and burglaries and things like that. So there's a bit of like adventure stuff in there. There's a bit of like darker fantasy elements in there. They focus on these intrigues between different houses and stuff like that. And that is, I feel, a really cool part. One, I think it's really, it's neat. It can make for some really cool stories. The second part is that you may already notice that there are certainly some parallels to at least parts of the Drizzt Do'Urden saga, growing up as a, son of a minor noble house, a smaller noble house in the Underdark, doing all kinds of assassination and warrior stuff with like all these houses, all these intrigues in this constantly dark place. So one of the reasons I picked the Vlad Tolstoy series here is for me to it would allow us to sort of like compare two series that are, more or less contemporary. Obviously, the first Tolstoy novel is slightly older than the first Drizzt Do'Urden novel, but that play with similar themes and are happening or getting published during the same sort of period. So it would allow us to sort of like make some comparisons and references and look at how different authors deal with similar themes in one way or another. There's certainly elements of like racism within the Tolstoy series, what with like humans and the Dragaeans being the actual like empire that runs the place and so forth. So that would be I feel they are interesting things to look at, both in just the Tolstoy series itself and in comparison with the Drizzt Do'Urden stuff. And I think that's worthwhile. And, it just sounds really cool, is the other part. So that is the first pick, Vlad Tolstoy series by Stephen Brust. All right, what is the next series, you may ask? It's Dragon Riders of Pern by Anne McCaffrey. Now, this is another like absolute classic and another one that doesn't get enough attention on social media these days because those books are also old. They have been around for a long time. Anne McCaffrey, sometimes together with Todd McCaffrey, published a lot of them, starting in like the 60s or late 60s, early 70s, all the way to more or less, for a long time is what I'm saying. And I would go through at least some of them in publication order. I have read some of them before, the Harper Hall trilogy in particular, but there are others that I haven't read. So the first one, Dragonflight, I haven't read yet, so we'll go through those one after another. And this is once again a book that is fantasy, or feels like fantasy, but is science fiction. Anne McCaffrey claimed it was science fiction, which upset a lot of people back in the days who said, like, well, dragons clearly are fantasy, otherwise there would be rocket ships, right? That's the big difference between fantasy and science fiction. Books with spaceships on the cover are science fiction. Books with dragons on the cover are fantasy. So what is this? Well, it's for science fantasy, yet again. Because, it's from that time when we didn't have those harsh sort of genre boundaries. And yeah, it's on the planet called, or world called Pern, and there's dragon riders, and there's harpers, and there's adventures and politics and society around that. It is another one of those classics that has had a huge impact on the genre. A lot of people who then became your favorite fantasy authors, possibly even my favorite fantasy authors, grew up reading Anne McCaffrey and grew up reading Dragon Riders of Pern. In that regard, it's a really cool thing. Plus, there's not that many popular or, women writing fantasy and science fiction in the 60s and 70s whose books are readily available. That is often kind of difficult. And, Anne McCaffrey is definitely one of the big names there, so going back and doing that, I feel is worthwhile. And plus, Dragon Riders. I mean, what do I have to tell you? It's Dragon Riders. It's also Harper's. It's really cool. And that is sort of like the reasons why I picked this one. As I said, I've read some of them before, and yeah, I want to read more of them. That's like the dark truth here. All right, that's the second series. Now let's look at the third one. And that is, of course, Anita Blake, Vampire Hunter by Laurel K. Hamilton. Now this is one that I have promised someone that I will definitely read them, and they felt like they might just be a perfect option for here. So they are one of those, well, urban fantasy series ongoing since like 1993-ish, I think. Thereabouts 1990s, all the way to more or less now, I think. They're about Anita Blake, who's a vampire hunter, and they're, that urban fantasy thing that got really popular for a while. I don't know if it's still that popular. That was usually often targeted towards a, young women reading. I'm not using any of those like derogative terms here. Certainly the Dresden Files are sort of like the dudes version of that up to a point. So it's our world, it's America, it's got vampires, it's got other kinds of monsters, and you have a woman who is thrown into that world and has to navigate that world of like supernatural stuff and natural stuff, or whatever you want to call it. And I have never read any of these urban fantasy series beyond, some Dresden, and I figured this might just be the one that I could get into, because it covers several decades of books, and reading something like that will definitely help me sort of like expand my horizon in a lot of ways, because written by a woman with a female protagonist, it certainly gets somewhat smutty over time, which I think is totally fine, but also probably is absolute pornography and does very much corrupt the souls of women, or so I've been told by YouTubers, other YouTubers, not me. So I'm getting ready to get my soul corrupted with that. I think it might be worth looking at one of those series that kind of started before the whole thing blew up in like the massive way it did, like around the late 90s, early 2000s. And once again, reading another like women author might be worth. It's definitely expanding my horizon in that regard, and it might get really, really cringy. Could be. It might get really, really interesting, and I don't know, is what I'm saying here. So that's one of the reasons why I picked the Anita Blake series. It sounds like something that might get really funny and might also get like really good, or just really, well, it could definitely lead to me losing my mind, which I guess is part of the of the plan here as well. So that is why I picked the Anita Blake Vampire Hunter series by Laurel K. Hamilton as the third option. Now we're getting slowly towards the final ones, which is the fourth one. And that is, of course, Left Behind by Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins. That's the other guy's name. I always keep forgetting him. Now, Left Behind is a weird one. It started in the 90s. There's 13 books. They're about the apocalypse. Tim LaHaye is, of course, a relatively famous evangelical preacher, activist, all those wonderful things. Started out as a young whippersnapper in the John Birch Society, so you know his heart's in the right place. He's certainly been fighting communism and atheism for all his life. And in the early 90s, he decided, together with Jerry B. Jenkins, to write a series about the rapture, which is, of course, the thing where the righteous ones end up in heaven and the meek inherit the earth, and the earth is a bit of a shithole at that point, the time of tribulation. And it is, well, it sold a metric fuck ton of books in evangelical circles. There are movies, there's all kinds of stuff around it, video games, I think, as well. I assume a lot of people grew up with these books, or at least encountered or know friends and people who, people around them who grew up with these books. And that, I think, sort of makes them nostalgic up to a point. The idea of taking a specific reading of certain parts of biblical mythology and some additional theology, just playing it completely straight into a, near-future science fiction kind of action thriller kind of story, is interesting in its own right. So that is one of the reasons why I think this may be fun. It's also going to be really, really terrible, bad, and all kinds of other stuff, because, there are people right now believing that this is the actual truth, and the rapture will come every single day. Yes, I know it was supposed to be like 3 or 4 days ago. Turns out that was not the case, and everyone is now happy that it wasn't. But, from things like the whole rapture TikTok stuff, this is very clearly very contemporary right now. This is very timely in a lot of ways, and that also, I think, is worth looking at. Now, I'm not an evangelical Christian. You may have noticed that. I'm not exactly very devout either. I'm a non-believer. I grew up, very, very, how can I say this, lax Catholic, in that I am baptized Catholic, and I went to First Communion. That's basically all of it. But I have read the Bible multiple times in different translations, and I have read other parts of Christian theology for all kinds of reasons. So I think I would also be able to add sort of looks at the underlying theological, political, and so forth elements of this, which I think is important because, the people who grew up with these books and the people who wrote these books, the people who believe the things that are in these books, are right now in power. Does this make me talking about them, possibly being critical about those things, anti-Christian, and thus a domestic terrorist? Well, it doesn't, because I'm not a US citizen, but certainly, this is urgent, this is really important right now, but it's also so ridiculously over the top that I think we can have an actual good time talking about the absurdism in there, because you just have to look at the names they chose for some of these things. It's bad, but it's bad in a way that I think can also be entertaining and not just grim and dark and desperate and hopeless, which I think might be worthwhile in the days and times that we live in right now. So that's why I picked Left Behind, and I've wanted to read them for a long time because I think they might be bad, but they might also be really interesting and informative and important in that regard. So that's my fourth choice here. Left Behind by Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins. So the final one is the one that is going to be somewhat more complex, and it definitely, once again, me exercising some personal demons. And that is a selection of novels by German author Karl May. Now, Karl May is possibly the most influential German author of the last 200 years in a lot of ways. He has been called Adolf Hitler's favorite author, and there is, apocryphal stories that Hitler did, in fact, send Karl May novels to his generals on the front so they could learn and adapt the tactics described in those novels. I don't know if that's actually true. I've heard it in several places, but I've never actually, checked up the sources. My point is, we know that Hitler and other people love these books. There's a reason for that. Everyone loved these books. I've read a bunch of them as a kid, and those were copies that I got from my father and from my grandfather. And that alone should tell you how impactful those... everyone born before, say, 1990, I think, in Germany has read those books or has encountered these books all the way to the 19th century. That's how big of a deal these books are. And they have shaped German attitudes and German culture and German attitudes toward different parts of the earth massively in that regard. Because, they are books that were, read by a lot of kids and adolescents and young adults, and that is why they are so important. They are also absolutely ridiculous. Karl was very much a grifter, a convicted fraudster for all kinds of things, and he started writing travel novels set in the American West and in mostly the Ottoman Empire, the then crumbling Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. There are some that go into other places, but those are like the big two that have like had the most impact, I would argue. And some of them were turned into some ridiculous movies that were filmed in Yugoslavia in the 1970s, and I guess everyone in Germany has at least images from those burned into their minds, and as I said, really important there. What is interesting there is Karl never when he was writing these books, he had never visited any of these places, so it's based on travel literature that he has read and his very, very active imagination. But because, most other people in Germany growing up also hadn't visited like the American West or the Ottoman Empire, a lot of people took that stuff for real, because he was basically writing them as like travel logs, as this is stuff that happened to me, although it was all, made up. And that has led to Germany, for example, having a very, very long ongoing and long-standing tradition of Native American cultural, appreciation, reenactment, whatever stuff in ways where, like, outside of America, the United States, there are probably the most actual people who speak different native languages live in Germany, because people have been studying this stuff for like the last 150 years, basically, and that is weird in a lot of ways. Because while Karl is definitely racist in all kinds of ways, it's usually a very positive, racism. And, once again, positive stereotypes are dangerous as well, but it's interesting to see that, right? Usually the native people, native tribes are the good guys in these novels, and there's corrupt and evil white men doing corrupt and evil white man shit. So that's interesting, and there's weird sort of spirituality in there. Karl was Christian in a weird 19th century spiritual kind of thing, where that moved beyond specific dogmata, and that is really interesting in that regard. So there are obviously a bunch of them, and I would pick, as I say, a sub-series from the West and stuff, which would be the Winnetou novels. There are 3 of them, and some adjacent to that. I'll decide which ones, and I would pick another sub-series which is set in areas that are around the Ottoman Empire, somewhere from the Balkans all the way to Sudan in the 19th century. Now, if you were aware of the Ottoman Empire and history in the 19th century, there's a lot of shit going down in those places, and whether it's in the Balkans and all these different independence movements and rebellions, and all the way to, places that then become Ottoman Palestine and then British Mandate Palestine, and the British are fucking around in Sudan and in Egypt, and there's a lot of background for adventures in that regard as well, and a lot of really bad Orientalism, and a lot of, once again, weird sort of sympathies where specific ethnic groups are praised as really cool and really good and noble savages in a lot of ways, and others are seen as very corrupt and so forth. And all of that is fascinating, because the adventure stories are also absolutely bonkers and really unrealistic stuff, right? So my point is, I can learn a lot from rereading these books to see how much stuff did I internalize when I read them as a kid, and how much stuff do I still need to figure out over this. I think you can learn a lot about German culture and German attitudes towards specific groups in the rest of the world. We can learn a lot about just weird 19th century history. We can learn a lot of obscure details and figure out whether they're actually true or not. There is certainly a lot of fun to be had here, and because it is such a German language specific kind of thing, right? I feel it might be really informative for non-Germans to, get some basic information about these books. Most of them, at least some of them, are definitely translated into English. I'll figure out how to let you know which ones and where to get them and so forth, if that is your choice. I think these could definitely be the most hilarious when it comes to just absolutely ridiculous and bonkers things in these books. Definitely exercising some personal demons with that one. And as I said, I will pick one sub-series around the Ottoman Empire stuff, the Near East, the Balkans, whatever that area, and one around the West. the American West, and we can look at those and, well, figure out why Hitler lost World War II, I guess. No, in all seriousness, I think those would be really interesting as well. So that's the 5 options I came up with. I did not get the P.G. Wodehouse books that someone suggested, not because I don't want to read them. I've only read like 1 or 2 of them. They are definitely really good and worth talking about. I just didn't feel like 13 P.G. Wodehouse novels in 13 days. I don't think I could do that right now. Possibly next year. Same goes for Animorphs. I just didn't feel like Animorphs this year. But I've read those suggestions, and there are, other stuff like Dragonlance might be something worth talking about in like the future as well. I just don't want to read D&D novels at the moment. It's something I've read some of them in the past, but not right now is basically where I'm at with that. So yeah, these are the 5. They are, once again, the Blood Taltor series by Stephen Brust, the Dragon Riders of Pern series by Anne McCaffrey and Todd McCaffrey sometimes, and the Laurel K. Hamilton's Anita Blake Vampire Hunter, Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins Left Behind, and Karl May's Winnetou, and whatever the Ottoman stuff is called in English translation. I don't know right now. Those will be the options. I'll link to the actual poll on the Patreon page. You don't have to pay anything to vote there. If you have further questions or whatever, put them down in the comments. I'll pay attention to all of this. I will announce the results on the 20th of October. I hope you, enjoyed this explanation. I hope you have ideas of which one you're going to vote for. I hope you vote in big numbers. Yeah. Read good books, like, subscribe, comment, do all those wonderful things. You can give me money if you feel like it. You don't have to. But most importantly, stay good, people. I'll see you in the next one. And until then, thanks and cheers.